December 25th, 1856, Christmas morning, Magnolia Grove Plantation, Mississippi. The air should have been filled with hymns and celebration, but instead it carried the metallic scent of justice served cold. By dawn, 7 members of the Morrison family lay scattered across their grand estate, their Christmas feast transformed into a tableau of reckoning. The killer moved through their home not with rage, but with the precision of someone who had planned every step, every breath, every swing of the blade for nearly a decade. Her name was Celia, and she had served the Morrison family for 18 years. 18 years of silent obedience, of bowing her head while they spoke of her as property, of watching them tear apart families like breaking bread at Sunday dinner. But on this Christmas morning, Celia didn't serve. She didn't bow. She didn't remain silent. Instead, she became something the Morrisons never expected. A woman who remembered everything and forgave nothing. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe because stories like this need to be told. The Morrison estate stretched across 2,000 acres of Mississippi Delta, a kingdom built on cotton and cruelty. The main house stood 3 stories tall, white columns gleaming like teeth in the southern sun, surrounded by magnolia trees that bloomed beautiful and twisted, just like the family that lived beneath their shade. Inside those walls lived Master Charles Morrison, his wife Eleanor, their 4 children, and Charles's brother William, who had returned from business in New Orleans just in time for Christmas. They were pillars of their community, regular churchgoers who quoted scripture while signing bills of sale for human beings. Charles Morrison was known throughout the county not just for his wealth, but for his particular brand of discipline. He believed in breaking spirits methodically, scientifically. He kept detailed records of punishments in a leather-bound journal, noting which methods worked best on different temperaments. Eleanor Morrison was no better. A woman who smiled sweetly while ordering lashings for imagined slights, who found pleasure in separating mothers from children as casually as rearranging furniture. But it was their treatment of one particular slave that would seal their fate. A young man named Samuel, barely 16, who had been born on the plantation and raised in the quarters behind the big house. Samuel had gentle hands, the kind that could calm spooked horses and coax melodies from broken fiddles. More importantly to Celia, Samuel had kind eyes that reminded her of morning sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Samuel wasn't just another field hand to her. He was her son in every way that mattered, though the law would never recognize such bonds between the enslaved. She had held him as a baby when his birth mother died in childbirth, had taught him his letters in secret, had sung him to sleep with songs that carried memories of a homeland neither of them would ever see. The Morrisons knew about the bond between Celia and Samuel. They used it like a weapon, threatening one to control the other. When Celia moved too slowly, they would threaten to sell Samuel. When Samuel showed any sign of defiance, they would withhold Celia's meager food rations. It was a game to them, watching how far they could push before something broke. But something did break, and it wasn't what they expected. It happened on a cold November morning in 1855, just over a year before that fatal Christmas. Samuel had been working in the stables when one of the Morrison children, young Thomas, decided to amuse himself by throwing rocks at Samuel while he worked. The boy was only 12, but he had already learned to wield cruelty like his father wielded a whip. Samuel endured the stones in silence until one caught him square in the temple, opening a gash that bled down his face. Samuel stumbled, dropped the bridle he was mending, and for just a moment his composure cracked. He turned toward young Thomas with something dangerous flickering in his eyes. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, but Charles Morrison witnessed it from the porch. To him, those 3 seconds represented the gravest sin possible, a slave looking at a white child with anything other than complete submission. The punishment was swift and brutal. Morrison had Samuel tied to the whipping post in full view of the quarters, ensuring every enslaved person on the plantation would witness what happened to those who forgot their place. But this wasn't just a whipping. Morrison had decided to make an example that would last. Celia was forced to watch as they stripped Samuel's back with 50 lashes. She was forced to stand there as Morrison heated a branding iron in the forge fire. She was forced to remain silent as they pressed that red-hot metal against Samuel's shoulder, the smell of burning flesh filling the air while Samuel's screams echoed across the fields. But the worst was yet to come. Morrison wasn't finished teaching his lesson. He announced that Samuel would be sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, the kind of place where slaves worked until they died, usually within 5 years of arrival. The sale would happen after Christmas, Morrison declared with a smile, so they could all enjoy the holiday season knowing what awaited in the new year. That night, as Celia tended to Samuel's wounds in the cramped quarters they called home, something fundamental shifted inside her. She had endured 18 years of degradation, of watching people she loved disappear into the machinery of slavery. She had survived by keeping her head down, by believing that somehow, someday, things might get better. But looking at Samuel's burned and bloodied back, at the way his hands shook as he tried to drink water, at the hollowed light in his eyes, Celia realized look that had replaced that someday would never come. Not for Samuel, not for any of them, not unless she made it come. She began planning that very night, not with fury, but with the cold calculation of someone who had finally found her purpose. She knew the house better than anyone, had cleaned every room, served at every table, memorized every routine and ritual of the Morrison family. She knew when they slept, when they woke, when they were most vulnerable. More importantly, she knew about Christmas. The Morrisons always celebrated Christmas Eve with a grand feast, inviting family and friends to gorge themselves on food prepared by enslaved hands. They would drink heavily, tell stories of their prosperity, toast their good fortune, while those who made it possible served them in silence. This year would be different. This year, Celia would serve them something special. She spent weeks preparing, not just planning, but gathering. The plantation had a garden where she grew herbs for the kitchen, medicinal plants that could heal or harm, depending on how they were used. She had learned about such things from her grandmother, knowledge passed down through whispered conversations and careful observation. Foxglove grew wild near the creek, beautiful purple flowers that could stop a heart if prepared correctly. Oleander bloomed year-round in the decorative gardens, its milky sap deadly if mixed into the right dish. Water hemlock thrived in the marshy areas near the rice fields, looking innocent as parsley but carrying death in every leaf. Celia gathered these plants slowly, carefully, never taking too much from any one location. She dried them in the rafters of her cabin, ground them with a stone worn smooth by years of use, and stored the resulting powders in small cloth pouches hidden beneath her sleeping mat. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was using knowledge meant to heal, to save lives, as a weapon. But after 18 years of watching the Morrison family destroy everything she held dear, Celia had learned that sometimes the only way to heal a wound is to cut out the infection completely. Christmas Eve arrived with unusual warmth, as if the very air knew something momentous was approaching. The Morrison family prepared for their feast with typical extravagance. The dining room decorated with garlands and candles, the table set with china that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The guests began arriving as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky the color of dried blood. Judge Whitman came first, a man who had sentenced more runaway slaves to death than any other magistrate in Mississippi. Behind him came Reverend Pike, who preached that slavery was God's will, while counting the coins donated by plantation owners. Dr. Hayes arrived with his medical bag, the same hands that declared slaves fit for sale, having delivered white babies into comfort and privilege. Each guest brought their own darkness, their own catalog of cruelties disguised as Christian virtue. They gathered in the parlor, sipping brandy and discussing crop yields while the enslaved who made their wealth possible moved among them like shadows, invisible until needed. Celia served them with perfect composure, her face a mask of servitude that revealed nothing of the storm brewing beneath. She poured wine, arranged flowers, lit candles, each action performed with the precision of ritual. To them, she was simply part of the furniture, as unremarkable as the wallpaper or the wooden floors beneath their feet. But Celia was counting guests, counting drinks, counting the minutes until the moment she had rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times. 7 guests plus the Morrison family made 12 people total, 12 plates to prepare, 12 portions to measure, 12 lives to balance against 18 years of suffering. In the kitchen, she worked alongside 3 other house slaves, women who had no idea what was about to unfold. Mary, who had been there almost as long as Celia, hummed spirituals while she basted the turkey. Ruth, barely 18 herself, arranged vegetables with shaking hands, still learning the rhythm of serving white folks. And old Beulah, whose joints ached with every movement, but who kept working because the alternative was starvation. None of them questioned when Celia took charge of seasoning the dishes. She had always been trusted with the spices, with the delicate balance of flavors that made Morrison meals legendary throughout the county. They watched her work with familiar efficiency, grinding herbs with her mortar and pestle, tasting broths with a wooden spoon, adjusting seasonings with the instinct of someone who had been cooking for decades. What they didn't see was the small cloth pouches hidden in her apron pocket, or the way she turned her body when adding certain ingredients to specific dishes. Judge Whitman's favorite sweet potato casserole received an extra helping of ground foxglove, the bitter taste masked by molasses and cinnamon. Reverend Pike's beloved cornbread stuffing was enhanced with water hemlock, chopped fine and mixed with sage. Dr. Hayes's preferred gravy got a generous portion of oleander sap, stirred until it disappeared completely into the rich brown sauce. Each dish was carefully planned, each poison precisely measured. Too little, and they might only become sick. Too much, and they might taste something wrong, might refuse to eat. But Celia had spent months calculating, testing on rats that plagued the grain stores, perfecting the dosages until she could kill cleanly and quietly. The dinner bell chimed at 8 o'clock, its bronze voice calling the family and their guests to feast. They filed into the dining room with the satisfaction of people who had never questioned their right to abundance. Charles Morrison took his place at the head of the table, Eleanor at the foot, their children arranged along the sides like a portrait of prosperity built on suffering. The guests filled the remaining chairs, their conversations flowing as freely as the wine. They spoke of politics and profit, of new legislation that would make slavery even more profitable. They laughed about recent slave uprisings in other states, confident that such troubles could never reach their peaceful corner of Mississippi. Celia and the other house slaves began serving, moving in practiced choreography around the table. The turkey, golden and glistening, took center stage. Around it spread the bounty of the plantation. Dishes prepared with ingredients grown by enslaved hands, seasoned with expertise passed down through generations of women who had never been allowed to sit at such tables themselves. Charles Morrison carved the turkey with ceremonial flourish, commenting on its perfect preparation. Eleanor complimented the seasoning of the vegetables, noting how the herbs enhanced their natural flavors. The guests murmured their appreciation, raising toasts to their host's generosity and good taste. They ate with the appetite of people who had never known hunger, who had never wondered where their next meal would come from. They praised each dish, called for second helpings, demanded more wine to wash down the abundance, and with every bite, with every swallow, they were consuming their own destruction. Celia watched from her position near the kitchen door, her face serene, her hands steady. She had imagined this moment countless times, wondered if she would feel satisfaction or remorse when it finally arrived. Instead, she felt something unexpected, a profound sense of completion, as if she was finally fulfilling a purpose that had been waiting inside her for 18 years. The first sign came 20 minutes into the meal. Judge Whitman paused mid-sentence, his fork halfway to his mouth, a confused expression crossing his face. His hand went to his chest, pressing against his vest, as if trying to relieve some sudden pressure. He excused himself, claiming indigestion, but his breathing had become labored, his face flushed with more than wine. Reverend Pike was next, pushing back from the table with a grimace. He complained of stomach pains, asked for water, then doubled over as cramping seized his abdomen. Dr. Hayes, ironically, was the first to recognize that something was seriously wrong. He stood to examine the Reverend, then staggered as his own vision began to blur, his medical bag slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers. The realization hit the table like a thunderclap. Charles Morrison's voice cut through the growing chaos, demanding to know what was happening. But his own words slurred slightly, his pupils dilated as the oleander began its work on his nervous system. Eleanor Morrison tried to stand, to call for help, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. One by one, they began to fall. Some collapsed in their chairs, others made it only a few steps before crumpling to the polished wooden floor. The dining room that had hosted so many celebrations of white supremacy became a scene of divine retribution, the Christmas feast transforming into a Last Supper none of them had expected. Through it all, Celia remained motionless by the kitchen door. She didn't run, didn't hide, didn't show any emotion beyond calm observation. This was her moment of reckoning, her answer to 18 years of degradation and loss. She had served them faithfully for nearly 2 decades, and tonight she was serving them one final meal, seasoned with justice and garnished with memory. The authorities found Celia the next morning, sitting quietly in the quarters where she had spent 18 years of her life. She made no attempt to flee, offered no resistance when they bound her wrists. When they asked why she had done it, she gave them the same answer she had prepared in her heart for months. "They took my son," she said simply. "They took everything." The trial was a formality, the verdict predetermined. No white jury in Mississippi would show mercy to a slave who had poisoned an entire family, no matter the circumstances. They sentenced her to hang, but Celia had already found her freedom. Not the kind that comes from papers or proclamation, but the deeper liberation that comes from refusing to remain silent in the face of evil. Her story spread through the underground networks of the enslaved, whispered from plantation to plantation, carried by field hands and house servants who understood that sometimes the only way to stop a monster is to become something more dangerous than the monster itself. They called her a hero, a martyr, a woman who had shown that even the powerless could find power when pushed beyond endurance. Celia died on a cold January morning, but her legacy lived on in every act of resistance that followed, in every enslaved person who refused to bow completely, in every small rebellion that chipped away at the foundations of an evil system. She had served her final meal, and it tasted of justice. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that history is written by those brave enough to remember the forgotten, then share it. Subscribe to ensure these voices continue to be heard. Because stories like Celia's don't just belong in the past. They belong wherever people fight for dignity, for justice, for the simple right to protect those they love.